Before we begin, drop a comment letting us know where you're tuning in from. And if you're moved by stories that don't flinch from the truth, hit subscribe. Help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers and be the reason these stories are never forgotten. It began in silence, not the kind that lingers after applause, not the silence of reverence or anticipation. This was the silence that fills a space when truth gets ready to speak. New Orleans Convention Center stood like a quiet cathedral that evening, packed and humming with nervous expectancy. Cameramen whispered last-minute directions. Journalists fidgeted with recorders. But backstage, in a small, underlit dressing room that smelled faintly of dust and pine floor cleaner, Senator John Kennedy sat with a quiet that didn't ask permission to exist. He didn't pace. He didn't check his notes. Instead, he let the stillness grow around him, like roots digging through stone. His suit had a wrinkle near the elbow. His glasses rested slightly askew on his nose. But his hands, resting on a thin stack of manila folders, those were steady. The folders weren't fat with exposition, just enough weight to carry what the country had forgotten, 7 minutes to go. In another corridor, Senator Adam Schiff moved like a man who knew the outcome before the curtain had even lifted. A flash of white teeth, a laugh too loud for the room, a rehearsed comment about Louisiana's muggy charm that earned polite chuckles. His entourage followed a few paces behind, faces split between devotion and dread. Aides double-checked lighting angles and water temperatures. Schiff's voice boomed in brief bursts, each word calibrated to register in the microphones they hadn't even wired yet. He wasn't preparing to speak. He was preparing to perform. In Kennedy's room, the overhead light buzzed softly. His campaign manager, Michael, leaned into the doorway, voice low. "You sure about this?" Kennedy didn't glance up. He kept tracing the rough edge of the top file. "I've been sure since before anyone knew there was a debate." Michael stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "We could stick to policy, jobs, infrastructure, safe ground." Kennedy looked up. "They'll ask about trust, about leadership. I'm not here to dodge it." Michael hesitated. "Then just don't make it personal." Kennedy's voice came softer than expected, almost tired. "It's already personal for too many people." 5 minutes to go. The stage crew gave the go-ahead. The moderator, stern and crisp in a navy blazer, adjusted the mic and nodded to the network director. The broadcast lights flared to life. "Good evening, America. Tonight, live from New Orleans, we bring you a conversation that might shape the months ahead. 2 senators, 2 visions, 1 country listening." The crowd clapped, not wild, not theatrical, but loud enough to prove they were present. Adam Schiff took the stage first, arms wide, grin sharp, thumbs flashing upward like billboards of self-approval. He looked born for this. He bathed in the lights like a sun worshiper. Then Kennedy stepped forward. No waves, no practice smile, just a quiet nod. A presence that didn't demand attention, it waited until you gave it willingly. He placed his files on the podium like an altar offering, and he didn't look at them. "Senator Kennedy," the moderator began, "what do you believe is the most critical failure in American politics today?" A hush. Kennedy leaned in slightly, barely shifting his shoulders. "Failures don't start with the people. They begin in rooms like this. In offices without windows, in signatures signed when no one's watching. The people patch the damage, they carry the cost." He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The sentence landed like a weight on glass. Schiff wasted no time. "Oh, come on," he barked, chuckling. "Let's not pretend that vague poetry is leadership. I've defended this democracy. I've fought for what matters. All he's done is read speeches." Some in the crowd chuckled, nervous, unsure. Kennedy didn't react, just glanced once at the audience, then at Schiff. "You defend democracy," he said evenly, "but sometimes in doing so, you've hurt it." The moderator cleared their throat. "Let's move on." But the room had already changed. Schiff performed like a man who thought he was auditioning for history. Loud, bright, animated. He cracked jokes, delivered rehearsed lines, called out corruption in high places. He gestured toward the crowd like a preacher at revival. Every sentence was a headline, every phrase built to trend. Kennedy just listened and waited. Then Schiff said something, offhand, thoughtless. "I've settled cases just to get them out of the way," he laughed. "Not because I was wrong, but because it's cheaper, faster. You sign a check, you move on. Welcome to politics." Kennedy looked up, a small movement, but the camera caught it, and the air caught fire. The moderator shifted in their chair. "Senator Kennedy, do you believe ethical compromise impacts public trust?" Kennedy stared at the moderator for a long beat, then to the crowd, then into the camera. "Most folks," he said, "don't have that luxury. If your boss cuts your hours, you can't settle. If your landlord doubles rent, there's no negotiation. You take the hit, you endure, you move on, but you don't forget." He paused, and the silence grew loud. Schiff laughed it off. "Every politician's been sued. Don't let him act like a choir boy. He's signed settlements too. He just doesn't admit it." Kennedy didn't flinch. There's a difference between settling and silencing, between losing and being crushed. He opened one folder, just one. "David," Kennedy said, "construction foreman, California, supported a housing project your office backed, raised safety concerns, was ignored, fired, sued, dragged for months in court until he had to settle with a clause that kept him from ever speaking." He held up the document, not waved, just showed. "I'm not David. I can speak." The moderator tried to move on. Schiff tried to cut in. But Kennedy wasn't finished. He spoke of Mary, an administrator in New Orleans fired during chemo. Of Thomas, underpaid for rebuilding a community center after a hurricane. Of Sarah, silenced after reporting safety violations. One by one, Kennedy said their names like a prayer, and the audience listened like they were at a funeral. "You want to talk about leadership?" he said quietly. "Real leadership shows up when there are no headlines. That when someone loses a job and no one tweets about it. When a veteran dies in a shelter because promises weren't kept." He laid out the next document, Fresno, a nonprofit for PTSD recovery, shut down due to a land redevelopment plan Schiff had supported, then abandoned. 3 veterans died homeless. One was named Henry. His son, Kennedy said, is watching tonight. The room stopped breathing. Schiff pressed forward, his voice suddenly thinner. "You don't know the whole story. You pull papers from files like you're a prosecutor. But leadership is messy. Things fall apart." Kennedy stared. "I'm not building a case. I'm naming the forgotten." When the moderator asked if these were isolated cases, Kennedy answered without hesitation. "No, they're buried ones." He held up another file. "And I haven't even gotten to the veterans." That single word fractured something in the air. Veterans. You don't toss it around. You don't use it for leverage. But when you say it with reverence, with fact, and with grief, it echoes. Kennedy did. And Schiff? He began to shift. Not politically, physically. Sweat shimmered at his hairline. His voice slipped into defense. Then desperation. He accused the moderator of bias, mocked the idea of inequality, called Kennedy a bitter man chasing headlines. A man in the front row stood and walked out. Not angry, just done. The debate was no longer a contest. It was a reckoning. When the moderator asked about restoring trust, Kennedy didn't speak of policy. He spoke of his father, of a small grocery store, of the kind of man who gave more than he sold, of how trust begins with doing right even when no one watches. "He worked until his legs gave out," Kennedy said. "I carry that memory when I vote, when I speak, when I name the ones who aren't in the room." He turned to Schiff. "I remember a man named Mark, staffer, Intelligence Committee, 2019, sent an email warning that your office was pushing a narrative without full evidence. He lost everything, family, health, hope." Kennedy held up an article, Oakland Tribune, staffer fired for dissent. Not New York, not D.C., just Oakland, but it mattered. Schiff looked like he didn't know where the floor was anymore. Kennedy didn't attack. He named, he remembered, he bore witness. The debate should have moved to closing statements. Instead, Schiff stumbled, literally. His body swayed, his breath hitched. He gripped the podium, then missed. A wave of aides swarmed. The room froze. Cameras kept rolling. As Schiff was led off stage, he turned, not to the audience, but to Kennedy's eyes searching for a word that never came. And then he was gone. Kennedy closed his file stack, didn't grandstand, didn't gloat, just whispered, "I'm ready to finish my statement." But the nation already knew. The moment had happened, and nothing would be the same again. It wasn't the stumble. Not really. That's what people said on the late-night shows, in live tweets, in headlines clinging to clickbait. But when the moment passed and the cameras shut off and the chairs were empty, what stayed wasn't the image of Adam Schiff faltering. It was the voice that didn't tremble. John Kennedy had not raised his voice once, and yet the country felt shouted awake. Hours later, media storms, quiet rooms. Kennedy sat alone in a small courtyard behind the hotel. The air still carried heat from the day, but the wind had turned. He wasn't reading the reactions. His phone buzzed endlessly, but he didn't reach for it. Michael did. From his tablet, the screen scrolled in a fever of motion. Fox News. A political reckoning. CNN. Kennedy doesn't flinch, Schiff falters. MSNBC. Truth or theater. TikTok clips exploded, 15-second edits looping Schiff's retreat, or Kennedy listing the names one by one. Some played dramatic music behind the files being laid down. Others added subtitles. You don't get breaks when you're already broken. Michael walked out with 2 coffees, set one down. They're calling it the most honest moment in political debate history, he said. Kennedy didn't answer. He just watched a leaf fall. The videos that wouldn't die. By sunrise, the clip of Kennedy speaking the veteran's name, Henry, had passed 2 million views. Then 5. Then 10. Comments poured in. I served with Henry. He wasn't a story. He was my friend. Thank you, Senator. I cried. I've never cried during politics. What is happening? He didn't perform. He remembered. On YouTube, a channel called Civic Mirror posted a reaction titled, "Why Kennedy's Calm Was Louder Than Schiff's Collapse." In the video, the host didn't analyze policy. He analyzed silence. What happened tonight wasn't a takedown, the host said. It was a reckoning. Not loud, not cruel, just steady. And when you speak steady for people no one listens to, you don't need to shout. The truth echoes without a microphone. Back in California. In a small apartment in Fresno, a man named Kevin watched the clip in the dark, eyes red. His brother Henry had died in that veterans program. Nobody ever said his name. Until now. He turned to his wife, held her hand. He didn't forget. She nodded, tears silent. Adam Schiff's world shrinks. Meanwhile, in a secure hotel across town, Schiff sat in a darkened room. His aides had pulled the plugs on interviews. Doctors cited exhaustion. His spokesperson blamed the stage heat. No details. Just, he's resting. But no one believed the collapse was just physical. Not after that kind of unraveling. His advisors huddled like survivors of a storm. Some wanted to fight back, dig into Kennedy's past. Others whispered that maybe it was time to let this cycle pass quietly. Schiff said little. At one point, staring at the ceiling, he asked, "Who was David?" No one had the answer. That, more than anything, rattled him. The letters start coming. At Kennedy's campaign office, a mail bin overflowed by noon. Dozens of handwritten letters. Not from donors. Not from strategists. From the forgotten. A woman in Monroe who lost her job during a housing scam. A veteran's wife from Sacramento. A grocery clerk from Lafayette. Each one echoed a version of the same story. No one ever said our names, until now. Kennedy read them all. He didn't sort by state or importance, just opened, unfolded, and listened. Michael found him still reading at 2 a.m. "You've got national coverage tomorrow," he said. Kennedy nodded but didn't look up. "These people aren't coverage," he said. "They're proof." A little girl's letter. In the evening pile came an envelope addressed in blocky blue ink. To the man who told the truth on TV, inside was a drawing. stick figures holding hands under stars, and a note. Dear Mr. John, my name is Mia. I'm 10. Mommy said I should watch you even though I don't like the news. But I liked you. You didn't yell. You were quiet, but you made my heart feel big. My dad says you're not like the others. I hope you don't change. Love, Mia. Kennedy held the letter for a long time, not smiling, just breathing. The political aftershock. By the next morning, polling data flashed wild across the networks. Support for Kennedy surged in demographics no one predicted. Rural independents, working-class Democrats, young first-time voters. But more than that, a new word started trending. Remember their names. People began posting their own stories under the tag. Photos of closed factories, letters never answered, settlements never paid. And at the center of it, not a political firebrand, but a quiet man with a stack of files. The response Schiff never gave. Schiff's campaign drafted statements, some strong, some apologetic. None stuck. Because Schiff wasn't a headline anymore. He was a silence people had finally noticed. One reporter put it best. Kennedy didn't just expose Schiff. He exposed the system's muscle memory, settle, silence, spin, forget. And he did it by doing none of those things. Kennedy's first interview. The request came from Face the Nation. They wanted an exclusive, a full segment. Kennedy said yes, with conditions. No set dressing, no sound bites, just people's names. That's the story. When the cameras rolled, the host asked, Senator, what do you think caused this moment to land the way it did? Kennedy didn't hesitate. Because too many people were screaming with no sound, and someone finally put a mic on them. Epilogue, the courtyard bench. Late that night, back in the hotel, Kennedy sat on a wooden bench. No crowd, no campaign buzz, just a quiet breeze and the sound of the city. Michael walked up, holding a tablet. You saw the girl's letter? Kennedy nodded. Mia. Michael hesitated. You know you could run for anything now. Senate re-election, governor, even higher. Kennedy didn't look up. I'm not running for anything, he said. I'm standing for something. And somewhere in a living room in Mississippi, a man hit play on the video one more time. His wife had worked for a housing project that never paid her final check. She'd cried for weeks, but tonight, they sat silent. Not with grief, with recognition. Because the echo was no longer coming from Washington. It was coming from everywhere. There are moments when the air in Washington feels different. It's not the humidity or the bitter chill off the Potomac. It's the silence in the hallways, the looks exchanged over half-finished coffee, the way seasoned politicians lower their voices even when no one's watching. Kind of atmosphere that tells you something's shifted, something that can't be undone. 3 days had passed since the New Orleans debate, and John Kennedy's name was being whispered in offices that once barely acknowledged him. In the Capitol Rotunda, reporters loitered with new curiosity. They weren't just hunting headlines. They were chasing something rarer, substance. Kennedy hadn't returned to D.C. yet. He'd stayed in Louisiana, touring shelters, speaking with veterans, sitting with displaced families who had written him letters. He didn't bring cameras. He didn't alert the press. He said he owed them more than airtime. He owed them time. Meanwhile, Adam Schiff had vanished behind press releases and protocol. His staff issued health updates framed in clinical vagueness, exhaustion, monitoring vitals, no cause for alarm. But no one was alarmed about his health. They were alarmed about his absence. In political circles, absence isn't neutral. It's dangerous. And in that vacuum, Kennedy's silence became louder. In Baton Rouge, Kennedy sat at a fold-out table across from a retired contractor named Elias. The room smelled of old paint and bitter coffee. Elias had been one of the first to write in. He'd lost everything after a housing project collapsed mid-construction, backed by legislation Schiff once celebrated on cable news. When the funding vanished, so did the protection. Elias was left with unpaid invoices, a crushed spine from a fall, and a court battle he couldn't afford. I kept calling their office, Elias said. Left messages, Wrote letters, no response. Then one day, I get a notice that my contract's been voided. No explanation, just gone. Kennedy didn't interrupt. He didn't take notes. He just listened, elbows on the table, eyes steady. They said it wasn't their responsibility, just local mismanagement, but it was his bill, his name on the press release. And then, poof, everyone walked away but me. Kennedy nodded once. I didn't walk away. Elias leaned back. His hands trembled slightly as he sipped from a styrofoam cup. That's the first time anyone said that to me in 6 years. In the background, Michael stood near the door, phone vibrating nonstop. National journalists were circling. Requests from NPR, ABC, even Al Jazeera. Everyone wanted to talk about the debate. But Kennedy wasn't ready. Not yet. Back in D.C., the House Oversight Committee held an emergency session. Not about Kennedy, not publicly. But behind closed doors, they talked about him. About the shockwave he had ignited. They called it the file strategy. A senior aide labeled it weaponized documentation. Another described it as a surgical strike, less about Kennedy, more about the buried system itself. Still, no one could discredit it. Every story, every document, every name had proof. Real people, real paper. No one could say it was slander. They could only say it was inconvenient. Schiff's team was unraveling. A communications advisor resigned quietly. Another was reassigned. Inside their war room, once bustling with election prep, a mood of frost had settled. Phones still rang, but the tone had changed. Allies were cautious. Donors were nervous. We didn't know about the Fresno program, one strategist said. No one told us about the veterans. Why didn't we know? Schiff sat at the head of the table, staring at a legal pad he hadn't touched. Because I didn't remember, he finally said. The silence was sharp. Not one person responded. No one defended him. No one challenged him. They just didn't know what to say. In Shreveport, Kennedy walked through a vacant lot. Weeds swayed through broken concrete. A faded sign read, Future Site of the Horizon Initiative. It had been a relocation project. 80 families. Empty now. The wind carried loose paper and the memory of promises never kept. He walked slowly, boots crunching glass. One man approached him from the sidewalk. He wore a veteran's cap, faded jacket, eyes that had seen too much. You said Henry's name, the man said. He was my friend. Kennedy shook his hand. I didn't want him to disappear. The man nodded. He didn't. Not anymore. That night, in a modest community center with mismatched chairs and warm soup, Kennedy sat at a folding table and opened another letter. This one from a woman in Kentucky. Her husband had worked a municipal contract under a policy Schiff's committee had fast-tracked. The oversight was minimal. The payments were delayed. When he tried to push back, his company blacklisted him. 3 months later, he overdosed. She had found the note in his truck. It wasn't angry, just tired. She wrote to Kennedy not asking for justice, just to have someone remember his name. Kennedy folded the letter slowly and slid it into the inside pocket of his coat. Michael stepped in again, holding the tablet, this time showing analytics. We passed 20 million total views across platforms, he said. 50,000 new subscribers. Engagement through the roof. Even CNN is replaying the full clip with minimal editing. Kennedy looked at the screen, then looked away. That's not the story. Michael exhaled. Then what is? Kennedy replied quietly. That we remembered how to listen. 2 days later, a private Republican senator from Ohio called Kennedy's office. The message was simple. We need to talk. Not about the campaign, about policy. Kennedy took the call. They didn't discuss Schiff. They didn't talk ratings. They talked about the Fresno failure, about what could be rebuilt. Not politically, structurally. You lit something, the senator said. Let's make sure it doesn't burn out. Kennedy agreed, not because it was good politics, but because it was long overdue. In New York, Schiff finally appeared. A quiet press conference. No fanfare, no spin doctors. He stood behind a podium, eyes glassy, voice hoarse. I've served this country with everything I have, he began. But it's clear that service doesn't exempt you from reflection. Reporters waited for a pivot, a defense, a jab. It never came. Some of the stories shared by Senator Kennedy caught me off guard, and maybe that's the point. Maybe we've all been off guard for too long. A few in the room looked up, surprised. One reporter whispered, "Is this remorse?" Schiff paused, took a breath. "I can't undo the past, but I won't ignore it anymore. That's all I'll say today." He stepped away. No Q&A. Just the shuffle of shoes and a nation unsure how to receive contrition when they were still waiting for accountability. Back in Louisiana, Kennedy visited a small chapel in a town with no traffic lights. He sat alone in the back pew. The priest didn't interrupt. No cameras, no speech, just quiet. He held Mia's letter in one hand, Jimmy's photograph in the other. 2 names, 2 weights. He stared at the stained glass window, colors flickering on his face, and whispered one sentence under his breath. Let them know they were seen. Later that night, Michael brought him a note from a woman in Florida. Her daughter had worked on Schiff's former committee, fired after raising concerns about internal pressure. No lawsuit, no settlement, just silence. She wrote, "She cried when she saw your speech. She said it felt like being unerased." Kennedy folded the note and placed it in the same stack by his bed. They weren't just files anymore. They were bricks in a foundation. Not a campaign, a movement. The next morning, Kennedy gave a brief statement from a small community park in front of a rusted swing set. No press platform, no polished backdrop. "I didn't speak for attention," he said. "I spoke because I've carried these names for a long time, and the weight wasn't mine to keep." He paused. "I'm not here to dismantle someone's legacy. I'm here to protect the ones who never got to have one." That night, a new hashtag surfaced. Legacy for the Forgotten. It wasn't from a news outlet or a strategist. It came from Mia's mother, and it caught like wildfire. By midnight, Schiff's official campaign site removed all reference to the Horizon Initiative, the Fresno Project, and the disputed relocation efforts. It didn't escape notice. Reporters called it a silent admission, but Kennedy didn't comment. He was already back on the road, answering letters in the passenger seat of a rental car. Michael watched from the driver's side, shaking his head. "You know you've started something we can't stop now." Kennedy looked out the window. "We're not supposed to stop." In a retirement home in Ohio, a man watched the full debate replay on PBS. His son had been blacklisted for whistleblowing. He hadn't spoken about it in years. When the credits rolled, he picked up a pen, wrote a name on a yellow notepad, and mailed it to Kennedy's office. That name joined the stack, carefully placed, never forgotten. Kennedy didn't carry a flag on stage. He carried stories, and the country unexpectedly, undeniably listened. The smoke of old systems was clearing, and through it, velvet truths began to shine. Not soft, not passive, but persistent, like memory, like justice, like names finally spoken aloud. There was something uneasy about applause when it came too late. The kind that followed you into a room after the fire had already started. The kind that didn't feel earned, but demanded anyway to keep the illusion alive. That's what it sounded like in the Louisiana State Legislature building when John Kennedy walked in for an unscheduled meeting with party officials. They clapped. A few smiled. Most didn't meet his eyes. He wasn't there to be congratulated. He knew that. They knew that. The lights were too bright, the coffee too bitter, the hallway too long. Aides shuffled behind him like shadows. Michael leaned close before the doors opened and whispered, "They're nervous, not proud." Kennedy nodded once. "Good, let them be." Inside, a semicircle of Democratic strategists and long-serving legislators waited around a horseshoe table. Names Kennedy knew, faces he remembered. Some had helped him rise. Others had quietly hoped he'd never stand too tall. A woman near the center, gray suit, sharp voice, cleared her throat. "John, before we begin, let me say, what you did last week was monumental." He sat. "I didn't do it for monuments." She smiled tight. "Be that as it may, you've drawn eyes to this state that we didn't ask for." A man on the left cut in. national scrutiny, ethical audits, veteran affairs departments circling. You kicked the hornet's nest and we weren't briefed. Kennedy looked down for a beat, then back up. Neither were the people who lost everything. Someone exhaled too loudly in the back. Someone else coughed. The room shifted. What we're saying, the woman continued, is that truth is powerful, yes, but so is timing. So is control. You didn't just call out Schiff. You opened the door for everyone who's ever been wronged to walk through with torches. Kennedy leaned forward. Good. Maybe the room needs burning. The silence afterward wasn't awkward. It was damning. After a moment, one of the younger staffers tried to lighten the air. Senator, you're being talked about as a possible presidential hopeful. There's momentum, but momentum without discipline becomes chaos. Kennedy's eyes narrowed slightly. And discipline without conscience becomes a machine. It was clear now. They hadn't invited him here to celebrate him. They wanted to contain him. They wanted the truth, just not this much truth. Not when it reached into their offices, their contracts, their donors. When Kennedy left the building, he didn't stop for the cameras waiting outside. He walked straight to the car. Inside, Michael tapped his tablet. You've got 34 new media requests, 2 fundraising platforms asking for quotes, and your national poll numbers just crossed double digits. Kennedy stared ahead. And how many more letters? Michael paused. About 260 today. Kennedy nodded. Start reading. That evening, in a town called Opelousas, Kennedy sat in a folding chair beside a man named Jerome. He was 59, paralyzed waist down after a workplace injury. He had reported the hazard months before. Company settled. The clause said he couldn't speak publicly about it. I signed because my daughter needed braces. My truck was breaking down. I didn't think anyone would listen anyway. Kennedy handed him a pen and a piece of paper. Write her name down. I'll carry it. Jerome blinked. Why? Because someone should. Jerome wrote slowly. The pen shook. Kennedy folded the paper and slipped it into his jacket. He didn't carry stories. He carried people. Meanwhile, Schiff was back in Washington, but not fully. His public presence remained minimal. He gave one radio interview, carefully scripted, where he said, "No one enters politics without some regret, but I've never acted without believing it was for the greater good." It didn't land. Not this time. The interviewer pressed about the Fresno veterans. Schiff faltered. "I didn't personally manage the contracts," he said. "That's a matter for the agencies." The host didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. The audience heard what wasn't said. Across the aisle, Kennedy's message began to pull strange gravity. A few Republican senators privately reached out. One left a voicemail. "We don't agree on much, but you spoke like someone who remembered who sent them here." Another sent a text. "We've got names too. No one's ever asked us to say them." But not all voices were friendly. A high-ranking Democrat in New Jersey went on MSNBC and said, "Kennedy's playing with fire. You dig through 20 years of documents, sure. You'll find pain. You'll also destroy governance." An op-ed in Politico called him the archivist of agony and warned that exposing the system too fast may do more damage than corruption ever did. Kennedy didn't respond. He went to a community fair in Lafayette instead. He ate red beans and rice under a tent with no cameras. A little boy walked up to him with wide eyes. "You're the guy who says names," he said. Kennedy smiled gently. "Sometimes." The boy pointed at a woman nearby. "That's my mom. She got sick and they fired her. Can you say her name?" Kennedy looked at the woman. She nodded, tears already in her eyes. "What's her name?" he asked. "Marisol." Kennedy stood. "Then that's what I'll carry." Later that night, as he walked through a gravel parking lot under a low yellow moon, Michael stopped him. "You're losing allies." Kennedy didn't stop walking. "No, they're revealing themselves." Michael caught up. "You're not just shaking opponents anymore. You're shaking your own side." Kennedy opened the car door. Maybe it needed shaking. Michael sat in the driver's seat, sighed. "You know you can't just keep saying names forever." Kennedy looked out the window. Why not? That's what they do when people die in wars. They say their names. They don't apologize for it. They don't edit it. The next morning, another letter arrived from a man in Oregon. His brother had been part of a housing pilot program tied to federal reforms Schiff supported. When the funding fell through, his brother lost his job and fell into depression. He died 2 years later. I'm not blaming one man, the letter read. I'm blaming the silence. Thank you for breaking it. Kennedy folded the letter, looked at Michael, and said softly, "We need a bigger stack." In Washington, the Ethics Committee had quietly opened a preliminary review of some of Schiff's past committee decisions. It wasn't a trial. It wasn't a sentence. But it was something no one had dared before the debate. Now, even whispers felt loud. Back in Louisiana, Kennedy gave a talk at a high school civics class. No script, no suit, just a white shirt and a notebook. A student asked him, "What's the hardest part of telling the truth?" He didn't blink. "When the truth hurts someone you used to stand beside." The class went quiet. Afterward, one teacher said, "You didn't mention Schiff's name once." Kennedy replied, "The truth doesn't always need a target, just light." That night, an unexpected message arrived. A former aide to Schiff's office. Not public, not ready to testify, but grateful. "You didn't ruin him," the message read. "You just remembered what we all tried to forget." And in a small hotel room in Baton Rouge, Kennedy sat at a desk under a flickering bulb, placing the day's letters into a new stack. He didn't label them. He didn't sort by location. He simply whispered each name once as he placed it down. Marisol, Jerome, Luis, Emery, Patrice. They weren't statistics. They weren't tools. They were people. And for the first time in years, someone had said them out loud. They began showing up without being asked. Not journalists, not donors, not politicians, but people. Hundreds at first, then thousands. They came with printouts, newspaper clippings, faded photos, court transcripts. They came with memories. They came with pain. Some traveled cross-country. Others walked from down the block. None of them wanted selfies. Most didn't even want to speak. They just wanted to hand something over. By the end of the week, Kennedy's staff had filled 4 storage crates with documents. Michael started labeling them by state, then by sector, healthcare, veterans, housing, environmental fallout. But Kennedy stopped him. "They're not files," he said. "They're names." So they stopped organizing and started remembering. In Atlanta, a woman named Cheryl handed him an envelope and said, "My brother was fired after he exposed a cover-up in a rural hospital. He didn't survive the fallout. Just say his name once." That's all we ever wanted. Kennedy opened the envelope. Inside was a photo, creased, water-stained, edges curled like dried leaves. On the back, in soft pencil, one word, James. He held the photo like it was glass. "James," he said. And for a moment, Cheryl stopped crying. Later that evening, Kennedy was scheduled for a live town hall with a major news network. He wore the same navy suit he had worn at the debate. No tie. Just the faint wrinkles still pressed into the shoulder from nights spent sitting on too many church pews and folding chairs. The host opened strong. "You've galvanized a national movement. Polls show you're outperforming every Democrat except the incumbent. Your approval is soaring." Kennedy looked at the camera, expression unreadable. "That's not the point." The host hesitated. "Then what is? That they were forgotten, and now they're not." Half the audience clapped. The other half listened. The host tried again. "But surely there must be policy behind all this. These stories are powerful, but what's your legislative plan?" Kennedy leaned forward. "You can't fix a wound until you name what caused it. This isn't just storytelling. It's testimony, and testimony leads to accountability." Backstage, Michael watched nervously. In a green room across the building, aides exchanged panicked texts. The campaign had no press release, no bullet points. Kennedy was off script, but that was the script. He wasn't playing a game. He was building something heavier than momentum, a reckoning. By the next morning, over 50 members of Congress had issued statements. some praising him, others warning of performative populism. One cable panelist dismissed the movement as emotional blackmail masquerading as policy. Kennedy didn't reply. He spent the day in a shelter in Tennessee, eating scrambled eggs on a plastic tray, listening to a man explain how he lost his disability case after a program was quietly defunded mid-year. The policy had been slipped into a budget package spearheaded by a coalition Schiff once led. "I don't hate him," the man said. "I just wish someone had told me the truth." Kennedy nodded. "You deserved better." That night, alone in his hotel room, Kennedy stood at the window, staring into a parking lot half lit by a broken street lamp. A boy walked by with a backpack twice his size. A couple argued in a truck with the windows cracked. The world didn't pause for politics. It just kept turning. On the table beside him sat two stacks. The first was the original files, the ones he'd carried into the debate. The second was thicker now, much thicker, unsorted, handwritten, raw. He reached for the second stack and read every name out loud, one by one. By the end of the night, his voice was hoarse. By morning, the news had changed. Not the headlines, but the tone. Instead of calling it a movement, they started calling it a disturbance. One article read, "Kennedy may destabilize more than just his opponents. He's challenging the system that raised him." Another warned, "Even noble intentions can become weapons if you don't know when to stop swinging." But Kennedy wasn't swinging. He was remembering. In a closed-door committee hearing, an advisor from Schiff's camp brought up a chilling idea. "What if this doesn't stop with him?" Someone asked. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if this becomes something we can't contain? What if people start digging into their own files? Start remembering their own names?" That afternoon, Kennedy was invited to speak at a university in Ohio. The auditorium was packed. Not just students, professors, janitors, police officers, nurses. He didn't give a speech. He read names. He opened a manila folder and said, "Alejandro worked 2 jobs in San Diego, lost his apartment after a housing program collapsed, settled for a payout too small to cover a deposit, lived in his car for a year, wrote to every office, got 0 replies." He turned the page. Delilah, administrative assistant, fired while recovering from surgery. They cited budget realignment, part of a cost-saving measure championed on the House floor. Her letter said, "I just wanted someone to admit it hurt." He paused, then looked out over the room. This is what policy looks like. Not graphs, not slogans. Names, lives. If we can't say them out loud, we're not leading. We're just managing fallout. No one clapped. Not at first. Then someone stood up, then another and another. No cheering, just standing, like a vigil. In the back of the room, a reporter whispered to his cameraman, "This isn't a campaign. This is a funeral for silence." The next day, Kennedy met with 2 former public defenders who brought forward evidence of a mass policy failure in Baltimore's housing court system, traced back to federal restructuring timeline Schiff's committee had signed off on. No one had flagged the irregularities. Hundreds of evictions, no follow-up, no accountability. Kennedy read the documents, said nothing, and added the names to the stack. That night, Michael finally pushed back. "You're carrying too much." Kennedy didn't answer. "You're not sleeping, you're not eating, and you're not letting anyone else speak for this." Kennedy finally looked up. "If I let go of it now, it disappears again. I don't know how to do that." Michael's voice cracked. "Then let me help. Let someone help." Kennedy paused, then handed him one envelope, one name. Michael read it, then sat down and whispered it aloud. That was how it started. By the weekend, a dozen volunteers were reading names out loud across state lines. By Tuesday, 23 more. A live stream called Say Their Names began broadcasting every night at 9 p.m. No ads, no politics, just citizens reading names of those impacted by policies no one ever took responsibility for. By the end of the week, 2.3 million people had watched. Then a new problem arrived. Kennedy's campaign treasurer received a legal warning from a national consulting firm. The firm represented several former committee members who had been named indirectly through policy outcomes Kennedy had cited. The letter warned of defamation through implication. It didn't accuse him of lying. It accused him of truth without permission. Michael read it twice, then handed it to Kennedy. Kennedy read it once and placed it in the stack. No commentary, no threat, just filed. That same day, a young girl in California posted a video online. Her mother had been part of a now-defunct educational grant program that dried up mid-semester due to redistricting and budget shifts. The family had to move. The girl lost her school, her friends, and her health insurance. In the video, she looked into the camera and said, "I don't remember everything, but I remember how quiet it got." The post went viral. Kennedy saw it while eating a plain sandwich alone at a rest stop. He watched the video twice, then said aloud, "I remember you," and added her name to the stack. Later that evening, Kennedy returned to the bench outside the hotel where he'd first sat after the debate. Michael joined him. "They're not going to let this go much longer," he said. "You're making them look in the mirror." Kennedy looked up at the sky. "Then let them see." Michael nodded. "They will. Just promise me something." "What's that?" "That you won't disappear when they start to come for you." Kennedy smiled softly. "They can come for me, but they'll have to say the names first." It didn't start with a press release. It didn't start with an argument or a scandal or a front-page headline. It started with a cold shoulder, the kind of chill you only feel when the people who used to clap for you now look through you. Washington wasn't ignoring John Kennedy. It was preparing to erase him. One by one, scheduled meetings got pushed back. Friendly journalists stopped calling. Emails from coalition leaders arrived with lines like, "We're entering a more sensitive phase, and let's circle back after tempers cool." A speech Kennedy had been invited to give at a national convention was suddenly removed from the docket due to time constraints, they said. But the program had 4 open panels. Michael noticed it first, then the interns, then the donors. "They're cutting you off," Michael said, "like blood from a limb they think is infected." Kennedy didn't look up from the stack of names he was still reading through. Let them. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pride. It was inevitability. He knew this day would come. In politics, there's a line no one says out loud. Tell the truth, but not all of it. Shine a light, but know where to stop. Kennedy didn't stop, and now the machine he once belonged to had turned. Not loudly, quietly, professionally, ruthlessly. At a closed-door committee meeting, a member of his own party questioned whether Kennedy's aggressive truth-telling was creating an environment of paranoia. Another warned that a culture of retroactive guilt was making leadership impossible. No one named him directly, but everyone knew who they meant. Meanwhile, letters continued arriving, more every day. A woman in Idaho who had been denied disability for a spinal injury after her program was defunded mid-year. A social worker in Kansas who lost her job after speaking up about case overload tied to a federal restructuring bill. A teacher in Florida who was offered a buyout if she signed a clause never to mention the abuse report she'd filed. Each name joined the stack. Each story carried the same undercurrent. They weren't just wronged. They were erased. At a town hall in Arkansas, a man stood up, voice shaking. "My father was part of a land deal tied to Schiff's energy committee back in 2013. He lost everything. No one believed him. They called him bitter. He died thinking his life didn't matter." Kennedy nodded. He was right. The man broke down in tears. Kennedy didn't move, didn't offer comfort. He just stayed, present, and that mattered more than sympathy ever could. That night, a senior Democratic strategist appeared on national TV and said, "We admire Senator Kennedy's conviction, but this is starting to feel less like truth and more like vengeance. It's setting a dangerous precedent. What if every vote from 10 years ago becomes a public trial?" The host asked, "Isn't that what accountability is?" The strategist blinked, then smiled. "That's a nice word. but politics runs on forgiveness. Back in Louisiana, Kennedy received a package wrapped in twine, no return address. Inside was a black and white photograph, a group of factory workers, all men, all smiling. On the back, scribbled in ballpoint pen, they built something. No one remembers. Kennedy stared at the image for a long time. He didn't file it. He taped it to the inside of his briefcase. Michael walked in a few minutes later holding a folder with new polling data. "You're still rising," he said. "But the press is starting to turn. They say you've weaponized empathy." Kennedy blinked. "I didn't know that was possible." Michael dropped into the chair. "They're scared, not of what you're saying, of what it's making people remember." Kennedy didn't respond. He stood up, picked up the original stack, the one from the debate, and placed it in a fireproof case. "People think this movement started with me," he said. "It didn't." Michael raised an eyebrow. "Then who?" Kennedy walked to the window. "You remember the girl?" Michael nodded. "Mia." Kennedy tapped the glass. "She was 10. She didn't ask for a campaign. She asked for someone to keep telling the truth." Michael sat back. "And what if they crush it?" Kennedy turned. "Then we keep telling it, crushed or not." 2 days later, Kennedy took the stage at a small church in Georgia. No teleprompter. No notes. He spoke of justice. Not the courtroom kind. The kind that lives in kitchen tables and late-night phone calls and envelopes never answered. The kind that dies in silence. He didn't call out Schiff. He didn't need to. The crowd already knew the names, already felt the weight. And that was the shift. This was no longer about a single opponent. It was about a culture of forgetting, a system allergic to accountability, a country tired of being gaslit. That night, Kennedy received a text from someone he hadn't spoken to in years, a former campaign manager from his early runs in Louisiana. The message read, "You're on fire. They'll either try to snuff you out or claim they lit the match. Be ready for both." Meanwhile, behind closed doors in D.C., a new committee was being discussed, an internal oversight panel, to investigate the ethics of retroactive exposure. They said it was about protecting national stability. But the staffers knew better. They were trying to build a firewall around the truth. At a press event the next day, a reporter asked Kennedy directly, "Do you feel you've alienated your own party?" Kennedy stared at her for a long moment, then said, "No. I just reminded them what it means to have one." She blinked, then whispered, "That's going to be the quote." Later that night, Michael pulled him aside. "There's talk they might freeze your committee access, maybe even cut funding." Kennedy nodded. "Then we'll go where they can't reach." Michael looked confused. "Where's that?" Kennedy tapped his chest. "In here." The next morning, Kennedy gave a short speech in a battered Union Hall in Ohio. Blue-collar crowd. Faces hardened by years of closed plants and broken promises. He didn't campaign. He didn't promise. He just said one thing. When systems forget your name, say it louder. And the crowd didn't cheer. They stood. In silence. In agreement. In something deeper than politics. That evening, a letter arrived from Mia. This time, there was a return address. It read, "Dear Mr. Kennedy, you said more names. I watched. My teacher played your video for the class. Some of the kids cried, but we also wrote our own names. Just in case the world forgets again. Love, Mia." Kennedy folded the letter with care, then added her name. Again, because some names need to be said twice, just to be sure the world hears them. The subpoenas didn't come as a surprise. They came with the same sterile language that always cloaked power. They were labeled procedural, nonpartisan, standard oversight protocol. But the truth was loud between the lines. John Kennedy was being warned. It wasn't a trial. It was a message. A message dressed in formality and stapled to the doors of democracy like a polite threat. A newly formed congressional ethics panel rushed into existence, lacking a public vote, but somehow already fully staffed, requested all communications, documents, and financial activities connected to Kennedy's outreach since the debate. They cited patterns of politically damaging disclosures and potential misuse of constituent records. Michael read the document twice, then once more, slower. They're accusing you of weaponizing pain. Kennedy looked out the hotel window. Rain tapped the glass like an old memory. Then they finally understand what it feels like. The next day, headlines split down the middle. Some called it a witch hunt. Others called it accountability. But the people knew better. They saw it for what it was. Not justice, not balance. Fear. The kind of fear you only feel when you've lost control of the story. Because by now, the story wasn't Kennedy's. It had broken open, poured out and spread like fire through paper towns and factory lines and broken clinics. A mother in Des Moines started an Instagram page called Names We Never Said. Within days, it had tens of thousands of followers, each submitting handwritten notes, names of relatives silenced by policies too complex to explain but too painful to forget. In Detroit, a bus driver organized a sidewalk reading of every letter Kennedy had read aloud in the town hall circuit. People stood in the cold, not because they supported a candidate, but because someone had finally made silence feel dishonest. In the basement of a church in Oakland, a group of veterans met and said aloud the names of every comrade they'd lost to overdoses, homelessness, and neglect tied to defunded outreach programs. Most of those names had never made it to the VA rolls. That night, they did. And still, Kennedy said little. While networks aired speculation, while party leaders condemned him for over-sentimentalizing governance, Kennedy visited a shuttered hospital in Mississippi. No cameras, no speech, just a walk down quiet halls where the lights hadn't turned on in 3 years. A nurse who used to work there waited at the entrance. She handed him a manila folder. Inside, termination letters, grant requests ignored, a spreadsheet showing hundreds of canceled appointments. They told us it was budget collapse, she said. But I read the minutes from the committee meetings. They knew. They just let it happen anyway. Kennedy added the folder to the stack. The stack was no longer a symbol. It was a burden, and it was getting heavier. That night, Michael got a call from an old contact inside the party headquarters. They're going to push him out, the voice said. Not formally, just quietly, no support, no funding, no press. Michael replied, that won't stop him. The voice said, it's not about stopping him. It's about starving the space around him. Kennedy knew. He always knew. He just never planned to need their space. He had his own, and it was growing. That weekend, a small rally in Pittsburgh turned into something else. Kennedy wasn't scheduled to be there. No campaign had organized it. But a teacher named Elijah read 10 names from his city, each one tied to policies stripped from memory, and people came. Over 1,000. They brought candles, paper signs, court documents. They held hands in the cold and repeated the names after Elijah said them. Not chants, not cheers, just names. One woman stood near the front and whispered, they want to make this go away. But they forgot. We've already remembered. In D.C., the ethics panel convened. 3 of the 5 members had publicly supported Schiff in the past year. 2 had voted in favor of the very policies Kennedy had exposed. They asked for Kennedy's files. He declined. Not out of defiance. Out of decency. They were given to me in trust, he wrote in his official response. They are not leverage. They are legacy, and I will not barter with them. The panel chair released a statement calling his response deeply concerning. Kennedy gave no interviews. Instead, he went to a middle school in Memphis, where a 6th grader named Kayla had sent him a drawing of her father, who had been denied a disability hearing before dying of a heart attack. I wanted to make sure someone remembered what he looked like, she had written. Kennedy met her in the school hallway, gave her a framed copy of the letter she wrote, now mounted beside a photo of her father Kennedy had tracked down. She held it like it was made of stars. That night, Michael asked him a question he had avoided for weeks. What happens if they win? Kennedy looked up from the stack. They already did. Michael froze. Kennedy stood slowly, voice softer than usual. Where they already won when people like Kayla had to beg for someone to care. They won when veterans died in silence, when hospitals closed with press releases, when whistleblowers were paid off and forgotten. I'm not fighting to win. I'm fighting because someone should have fought back a long time ago. Michael nodded. Tired, but clear. The next day, Kennedy held a press conference. Not to defend himself, but to release something new. A digital archive, open source, tens of thousands of pages scanned, names redacted only when requested. No commentary, no spin, just facts, just truth. A reporter asked, "Isn't this political suicide?" Kennedy replied, "Depends what you think politics is for." Another reporter asked, "What about your career?" Kennedy paused. "I'd rather bury my career than bury another story." And the room went quiet. Then someone stood. Not a journalist, a janitor. He'd been working the back of the room all day. He stood, holding a mop, and said just one thing. "My brother's in your archive." Kennedy nodded, then said his name. The janitor sat back down, and no one interrupted, not even the cameras. That evening, Schiff made a statement. It was brief. He didn't deny the ethics committee was created in part by his allies. He didn't mention Kennedy by name. He just said, "It's time to move forward." The next morning, Kennedy received a voicemail from a woman who had sent a letter weeks earlier. She was crying, but smiling. "You said his name. I didn't think you would. I didn't think anyone would." And then a pause. And then the quietest sentence yet. "You made me believe again." In a world allergic to memory, Kennedy had built something dangerous. Not a campaign, not a movement, a mirror. And now the nation had to choose, look away or look in. There was a moment just before the sun broke over Baton Rouge, when the street lamps flickered out and the city held its breath. The kind of moment no one plans for, no one photographs, no one tweets. A quiet pause in the world. And in that sliver of hush, John Kennedy sat on a hotel bed, dressed but unmoving, a black binder on his lap, unopened. Outside, protesters had begun to gather. But they weren't angry. They weren't yelling. They were holding candles, dozens of them, then hundreds, all waiting not for a slogan, but for a signal. Inside, Michael paced the carpet, cell phone glowing in his palm. "It's starting to get out of our hands," he said. "People are demanding you retaliate. They want names, not just the forgotten ones, the powerful ones, the ones who wrote the checks." Kennedy ran a finger along the binder's edge. It wasn't a stack of stories. It was something new. Proof. Not just of pain, but of complicity. Signatures, agreements, emails with timestamps. And some of those names were from his own party. Michael placed the phone down. "You drop this and the dam breaks. We stop playing defense." Kennedy looked up. "I don't want a flood." Michael stepped closer. "Then what are we doing, John? We've been in the fire for weeks. They've cut off your funding. They're smearing your name. They're building a legal case to have you censured. At some point, you have to punch back." Kennedy stared at the binder. "That's the problem. Once you punch back, you start swinging. And if I swing with this," he tapped the binder, "I stop carrying names. I start breaking them." Michael didn't answer, because he knew it was true. Retaliation would work, but it would also change everything. Across the country, the debate had shifted. Kennedy wasn't just being questioned for what he'd said. He was being baited for what he hadn't. People wanted blood now. They wanted a headline to match the hush. News anchors speculated endlessly. Would Kennedy expose the co-sponsors who buried healthcare funds for rural veterans? Would he release the private memos between Schiff's allies outlining how to defund shelters while rebranding the cut as urban optimization? The media kept poking the bear, and Kennedy kept walking past the cameras. At a town meeting in St. Louis, a man stood up, angry, eyes red. "You've got the files, Senator. Why won't you use them?" Kennedy stood still. "I'm not here to destroy someone. I'm here to restore what they forgot." The crowd didn't cheer. They listened. And in that silence, something deeper stirred. Later that night, a former staffer from a congressional office called Michael anonymously. "I've seen what's in that binder," she said. "I was told to help scrub references to a housing initiative collapse. We were told it was off books, no trace. If you release it, they'll claim you forged it." Michael asked, "Why are you calling?" She paused, then said, "Because someone finally stood still while everyone else kept running." When he told Kennedy about the call, Kennedy didn't blink. He placed the binder on a side table and went back to his letters. That night, the candlelight vigil in Baton Rouge grew. No music, no speeches, just names, read softly by strangers who had memorized them. At one point, a woman named Rena stepped forward. Her husband had taken his life after being forced to sign a gag order in a federal contractor dispute. She held the contract in one hand. Kennedy took it from her gently. "I can read it for you," he offered. She shook her head. "I need to." And she did. Every line, every clause. And then she folded it, kissed it, and whispered, "No more hiding." Someone clapped. Just once. Then others joined. Not a roar. A tide. The next day, the ethics panel filed its first formal motion against Kennedy. Negligent release of emotionally manipulated evidence, they called it. Breach of constituent confidentiality. A senator who had once fundraised with Kennedy co-sponsored the resolution. Michael stormed into the hotel room with the document. "They're trying to paint you as a manipulator. They're saying you're exploiting grief." Kennedy closed his eyes. "Then let them sit in a room with Mia and say that." Michael sat down, breath shallow. "You're not breaking, are you?" Kennedy shook his head. "I'm not even bending." That evening, on a national broadcast, a political analyst made an unexpected comment. "This isn't about Schiff anymore. Kennedy's not fighting a man. He's confronting a generation of leadership that made silence a feature, not a bug. They taught America to forget, and now someone's remembering too well." In New York, Schiff declined to comment, but aides leaked that his approval ratings had plummeted. He spent most days inside now, not hiding, just waiting. For what? No one knew. And still, Kennedy didn't retaliate. Not with names, not with folders. He kept walking, kept speaking, kept reading. In a gymnasium in Colorado, Kennedy stood before a crowd of teachers and read the names of school staff who lost jobs after a funding reallocation redirected resources to digitization initiatives, written into a federal edtech proposal. Half the names were submitted anonymously, but Kennedy read them anyway. When he finished, a man walked up and gave him a note. It said only this: "You've made truth louder than shouting." He folded the note and added it to his coat pocket, next to Mia's letter. That night, Michael stood in the hallway out Kennedy's room. "I need to know something," he said. Kennedy looked up from a notebook. "Ask." "If you release that binder, you'll crush them. Schiff, the panel, half the leadership." Kennedy waited. "But if you don't, they might crush you." Kennedy closed the notebook. "I don't want to win that way." Michael's voice dropped. "Then how do you win?" Kennedy stood slowly. "I don't. We do." Outside, the candlelight vigil turned into a march. No slogans, no flags, just thousands walking with letters in hand. The next morning, Kennedy gave a speech from the steps of a courthouse in Louisiana. Not a campaign event, not a rally, just one microphone, one podium, and one truth. They asked me why I don't strike back, why I don't name those who signed the memos, who approved the budgets, who vanished when it fell apart. And here's my answer. Because we don't heal by making more wounds. We heal by refusing to pretend the old ones didn't happen. He looked at the cameras. "I will not trade one silence for another. I will not become the noise I've spent my life standing against." A pause. Then the final words. "I will not turn the truth into a weapon, because it was never meant to kill. It was meant to wake us up." And for the first time, even the opposition stayed quiet. Not because they agreed, but because something sacred had just been said. Later that day, Kennedy walked past the binder, still unopened, still untouched. He placed it on a high shelf, not to forget, but to remind himself Sometimes the greatest power is knowing what you could do and choosing not to. There's a moment in every storm when the thunder stops pretending to warn you. It just breaks. And that's exactly what it felt like across Washington the day Senator John Kennedy received the formal notice. The censure hearing would proceed. Not theoretical, not advisory, official. Filed under conduct unbecoming of a U.S. Senator. The Ethics Committee accused him of persistent and deliberate actions that blur the line between constituent confidentiality and political theater. It wasn't just about the letters. It was about the movement. It had grown too large to ignore and too honest to tolerate. Michael handed him the official document in the hallway outside the meeting room. They're going to do it. Censure you, strip you of committee voting power, freeze your office budget. Kennedy took the paper, skimmed it, and looked up. What else? Michael blinked. What do you mean? Kennedy folded the paper. You said they're going to do all that. What else are they afraid of? Michael didn't answer. He didn't have to. They were afraid of something deeper. The idea that one man, without a pack, without a flashy campaign, without compromise, had somehow shattered the illusion that truth belonged only to those who controlled the narrative. Inside the hearing room, Kennedy sat alone at the end of the long wooden table. No nameplate, no folder, just him. 3 senators sat across from him, flanked by aides who whispered legal strategy and optics advice between gulps of coffee. The chairwoman opened her remarks slowly. Senator Kennedy, this is not an indictment of your character, but of your conduct. This is not a punishment for speaking truth, but for abandoning discretion. Kennedy said nothing. We do not question your sincerity. We question your method. Kennedy leaned slightly forward. You question the mirror, not the reflection. A murmur swept the room. The chairwoman tapped her pen once, a sharp metallic tick. You are entitled to a closing statement before we proceed with deliberation. Kennedy stood. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't read from a paper. He spoke like a man who knew this might be the last time they ever listened. You're here because you're afraid, he said. Not of me, but of what I've made impossible to forget. He looked at the youngest senator on the panel. You signed a bill that restructured mental health outreach programs in Appalachia. I've read the emails. I've seen the numbers. You knew people would be left behind. You called it the cost of optimization. And people died. The senator shifted uncomfortably. Kennedy turned to the next. You sat on the subcommittee that approved housing disbursements for families affected by hurricane displacements. But you redirected 30% of those funds to a consulting firm that billed $5,000 a day to study community trauma responses. Not to fix it, to study it. The third senator opened his mouth, but Kennedy cut him off with calm precision. I'm not saying you're evil. I'm saying you're convenient. Silence. He stepped back. I didn't come here to burn your house down. I came to ask why it has no doors. The chairwoman paused for a long time before speaking. We will recess for deliberation. Kennedy nodded and left the room. Outside, Michael was already reading live updates on his phone. They're streaming this. Over 10 million views in under 20 minutes. You've got international reporters asking for comments. Kennedy kept walking. He wasn't interested in metrics. He was interested in memory. That evening, in a quiet office in Shreveport, Kennedy opened a letter from a man named Will. It had arrived weeks ago, but had gotten lost in the shuffle. The handwriting was uneven, faded. I was a school janitor for 19 years. My pension got gutted when a budget loophole closed our district early. I spent the last 4 years applying for relief. Nothing. I watched my own grandson drop out because I couldn't help him. I'm not asking you to fix it. Just say my name once. Kennedy whispered it. Will. He folded the letter and placed it in the drawer with the others. The next morning, the panel's decision went public. Censured. Effective immediately. Kennedy would retain his Senate seat, but lose voting power on 3 key committees. He would no longer be invited to closed-door deliberations. He would no longer receive party-funded travel budgets. He would no longer be in the room. And that, they thought, would be enough. But outside the Capitol that day, something unexpected happened. A line had formed. It wrapped around the block. Veterans, teachers, fired social workers, former factory employees. They didn't protest. They didn't chant. They brought folding chairs, and they read, one by one, softly. Names, hundreds of them. It spread like water on dry land. Across America, people began holding memory vigils. No signs, no slogans, just names. In Phoenix, they read the names of unpaid tribal contractors. In Chicago, former healthcare workers read the names of patients lost during funding gaps. In Boston, a group of teenagers read their parents' names. The press tried to find a label. Activism? Performance art? No one knew what to call it. But the country knew how it felt. And Kennedy? He returned to Louisiana. No entourage, no headlines, just one suitcase. He spent the night at the home of a retired mechanic who had invited him after seeing the debate. They sat on the porch, drinking sweet tea. The man asked, "Why didn't you drop their names?" Kennedy looked out over the field. Because that's what they would have done. The man nodded once. And they didn't speak for the next half hour, just listened to crickets and the wind through the weeds. The next morning, a staffer from the ethics committee resigned, publicly. In her letter, she wrote, "I thought we were defending the institution, but now I see we were defending its blindfold." That night, Michael received a voicemail from someone at the Justice Department. "You didn't hear this from me, but there's a real investigation opening. Not into Kennedy, into everything he uncovered." Michael played the message for Kennedy. For the first time in weeks, Kennedy allowed himself a breath of something close to hope. Not for himself, for the names. The following day, in a back courtyard of a community library, Kennedy addressed a small crowd. No stage, just a picnic bench. "They took my voice in the room," he said. "So now I'll speak outside of it." He held up Mia's letter. "This is what power looks like." And then he opened a notebook and read new names. No thunder, no climax, just clarity. That night, someone left a note on his windshield. It was written in pen, barely legible. "You're not just saying names anymore. You're helping us remember our own." Kennedy stared at it for a long time. Then he did something rare. He smiled. Because he knew what came next. And so did they.
The train arrived late that morning in Washington, D.C., pulling through a mist so dense the station lights looked like stars underwater. John Kennedy stepped off the final car with no staff, no security detail, and no press entourage. Just a worn leather briefcase, the same one he carried the night of the debate, though now the latches didn't quite close. There were too many names inside. He didn't wear a suit, just a black coat, dark slacks, and a white shirt creased from travel. He looked less like a senator and more like a man returning to something that never truly welcomed him. The Capitol building loomed ahead, its white columns clean and polished, as if no truth had ever passed through them without being softened first. Michael was waiting at the curb, holding a coffee and a quiet urgency. "They're holding the floor until noon. They're not saying it, but this might be your last chance." Kennedy didn't ask last chance for what. He already knew. He took the coffee, nodded, and walked the long stretch of concrete toward the east entrance. He passed 3 aides in dark suits who recognized him but didn't speak. He passed the reporters standing behind velvet ropes. They didn't shout questions, just raised their phones. Inside, the marble echoed like a cathedral. His footsteps didn't rush. Each one belonged there. By the time he reached the chamber floor, a low murmur was already rising. The clerk at the side whispered that Senator Kennedy had requested 10 minutes. That request had not been granted. The majority whip had tabled it. But then something happened no one expected. The sergeant-at-arms stepped aside, and the room, heavy with politicking and procedural fatigue, watched as Kennedy walked to the center aisle and stood behind the microphone. He didn't ask permission. He didn't seek recognition. He simply waited. The speaker raised an eyebrow. "Senator Kennedy, the chair has not recognized." But he was already speaking. Not into the mic, into the silence. "I don't need to be recognized," he said. "I just need to remember." The room didn't interrupt, because some voices don't need volume to be heard. Kennedy placed the briefcase on the podium and opened it. The files inside weren't in folders anymore. They were folded letters, crumpled photos, scanned eviction notices, settlement agreements, obituaries. He pulled one. Read it. Rebecca Harling, school teacher, Pennsylvania, denied benefits after budget recalibration in 2014, died from untreated lupus complications. Her sister wrote me, said she only wanted someone to say her name. He looked up. Saying her name isn't political. It's human. He pulled another. Tony Silva, landscaper, California, fired after reporting equipment violations under a grant-funded training program. Signed a non-disclosure agreement worth $1,000. Bought groceries, then disappeared. He kept reading, one name after another, one silence broken after another. The chamber froze. Even those who'd once rolled their eyes at Kennedy's speeches now sat motionless, not because they'd changed, but because something had. The country. Across the gallery, staffers stood behind the seats. Some had tears in their eyes, not from partisanship, from recognition. When Kennedy reached the end of the briefcase, he reached into his pocket. Mia's letter. It had been folded so many times the paper was soft. He unfolded it carefully, read it slowly. "Dear Mr. John, my name is Mia. Mommy said I should watch you. I think you are brave. I think the truth matters. Thank you for saying things like that. Love, Mia." He looked up. She's 10 years old, and she remembers more about decency than half this room. The speaker stood. "Senator, you are out of order." Kennedy didn't flinch. "I know, but so is history." A slow rustle swept the floor, and then something unthinkable happened. A senator from the opposing party, who had once voted against Kennedy's housing amendment, stood up and said, "Let him finish." The speaker hesitated, then nodded. Kennedy took a final envelope from his coat. "This was mailed anonymously," he said. "It only said, 'He cleaned my father's blood from the floor and never got hazard pay.'" He let the words hang there, not as condemnation, as inheritance. He closed the briefcase slowly, then looked at the room. "I've said everything I needed to say, but the truth won't stop just because I do. That's the thing about remembering. Once you start, you can't go back." And then he stepped away from the mic. No applause, no thunder, just silence. A silence so full it pressed into every wall. He walked out of the chamber with no escort, no aide, no camera crew. Just the quiet weight of what he'd carried. Outside, the street was lined. Not with protesters, not with voters, with chairs, folding chairs, empty. Each with a name printed and taped to the back. A silent vigil for those who were never remembered. He walked past them slowly. Some people stood beside the chairs. Others knelt. No one spoke. And for the first time since the debate, Kennedy let himself cry. Not for the system, but for what it could have been, for what it might still be. Back at his small rented office that evening, he sat down at the desk, looked at the last name on the last page of the last letter in his briefcase, and whispered it once. Then again, just to be sure it wouldn't be forgotten. And then he wrote Mia back. The first words on the page were these: "You reminded me that truth isn't a weapon, it's a light. And when we shine it together, it stops being a burden." Then he folded the letter, signed it, and slipped it into an envelope marked for Lafayette. Outside the window, the country buzzed. But inside that room, something had settled. Not justice, not peace, but remembrance. And that was enough for now, because John Kennedy didn't change the system. He made it look in the mirror. And sometimes that's all it takes to start again. And